already discussed what sharpening is, so you should have a good understanding now of how it works. We're now going to take this sleepy dog image and see how it works in practice. The first thing I'm going to do is to come over to the toolbox and find the zoom tool, which is up here at the top, and then we're going to double left click it. That will set the magnification of the image to 100%, at which point we're seeing one image pixel represented by one screen pixel. The upshot of that is that we're now seeing every pixel inside of our image. We're seeing it on screen. And when we're sharpening an image, that's really important. At 100%, we essentially get the best preview of the photograph possible. So naturally, when we're doing fine detailed adjustments like sharpening, as we are here, then this zoom ratio will be the one that we want to use. Now, in order to add the sharpening, I'm going to click on the enhance menu up here at the top and then come down and click the adjust sharpness command like so. Now, if I move this up to the top right, we can also see our image in the background. And I also want to make you aware that the values right here should be set to their default so that we're both starting from the same place. So if they're not, then go ahead and move the values accordingly. I'm going to set mine to 100 for amount and 1.0 for radius, and then remove is set to lens blur and more refined is switched off. There we go. Before we go any further, it's important to note that you're watching me do this on a movie that has been compressed down to a respectable file size, and inevitably when you're working with compression, sure, you get a clear defined picture, but you could also lose out on some of the very minor pixel level adjustments that I'm making, and that is going to be a reality as you're watching this particular video. There are going to be some very fine tweaks that I make that you're perhaps not going to be able to see on your screen as you're watching me, just because the compression of the video when I rendered it to send out on this course was just a bit too much, and it took away some of that detail from the final version of the image. So it will unfortunately restrict you from seeing some of the modest changes that we're making. That's why I recommend that if you're going to get hold of those project files and follow along on just one of these tutorials, let it be this one for our discussion on sharpening. Now, a great way to really get a sense of how the adjustment is going to look is to click and hold on the preview pane like so. We've not applied a very harsh effect so far, so we're not going to see a huge difference. However, if I take the amount slider up to say 400, somewhere in that region, then we will start to see how this filter is affecting the photograph. Go ahead and zoom into the eyes because I want you to see one of sharpening's trademarks. By the way, I'm zooming in using the small zoom controls beneath the preview pane. I'm also dragging around to find the eyes as well. Notice that if I click and hold to see the original image, the green highlights inside the dog's eyes are all green. But if I release, then we see it's now filled with this white specular highlight. Well, this is just a consequence of the sharpening process, adding contrast to the image. As we saw in the previous video, the darker green pixels are turning even darker, and the lighter green ones are turning white. The trick is to avoid this kind of thing happening en masse throughout the image when sharpening for real, because this really does serve a good demonstration of what happens if you add too much sharpening to the mix. We start blowing out some of these highlights and we start over darkening some of the shadow detail, and we end up with an image that just doesn't look right. Notice as well that if I increase the radius and let's say I boost this up to 7 or 8, we really start to thicken up the radius of the sharpening, and if I zoom back out to 100%, we see what a mess we're actually left with. If I take the amount value back to 100% and leave the radius high, we get a gentler, increased contrast sharpening effect. If I drag the preview down to the bottom left corner like so, you'll see that we're especially sharpening the larger details in the image and not making much of an impact on the smaller detail, such as this pattern right about here. If we go for the opposite, say move the radius slider back to 1.0 and then nudge the amount slider up to 3 or 400, we again see the sharpening, but this time it's an altogether more detailed effect than we saw before. We're now seeing the filter fiercely scour the image for small details and then attempt to bring them out. That's especially evident if we look at the same pattern and how it now stands out as a fairly significant change in the image. Meanwhile, the borders of the checkered pattern are far more modest than they were previously. Okay, let's set things back to the defaults of 100 and 1.0 over here in the controls, and then let's drag the preview back to the dog, which is always better than starting at an old quilt. Now, if we were doing this thing for real, the first thing that we're going to do is to edge up the amount slider just to see what we get. A lot of this will be trial and error, and once we've done a few, getting the right formula will be easier and easier. But I'm going to get to about 200% and then I'll click the preview to see how that's looking. I'll drag down into Zoe's body. This is Zoe the dog, by the way, our little West Highland Terrier. Probably should have mentioned that at the offset. But we can see that if we drag down and even zoom in a bit, we are starting to bring out some noise. And when we start to see this happening, it's usually confirmation that we've gone far enough. So I'll leave things as they are. Now, as far as the radius value goes, you're going to want it fairly low. Probably 90% of the time, you're going to want it fairly low anyway. Make sure that you're zoomed in at 100% again and that we're looking into Zoe's face. Now, the best way to work with radius is to make our adjustments from the keyboard. So I'll click into the value to activate it, and then I'll use the arrow keys to move the value around. I'm also occasionally going to incorporate the shift key into that mix so we can see where we stand. And as you can see, if we go as far as 2.5, that's got the look of going too far. I'll take that back down to 1.5 and then I'll just nudge it up a few, and I'd say that when we get to 1.8 the image is starting to really pop on screen. As you can see, it's not measuring that against anything. I'm just going with my gut feeling based on what I've seen. Now, I might just drag the preview back down to the quilt pattern to see how things are looking, and to be honest, my first thought is that we may have overdone it a bit. To counteract that, I'll bring the amount slider back down to something approaching 150, and then I'll lower the radius value just a couple of notches also, all the time keeping an eye on how the preview looks, because that's the most important thing. Forget the figures, the important thing is how your image looks when we're making the adjustment. And I'll drag the preview back up to Zoe to see how she's faring, and I'd say pretty well as it turns out. Well, I'm happy with that, so I'll click the OK command to confirm my changes, and if we make sure our preview is set at 100% view size, then we should start to see a fairly accurate preview of the finished photograph. With sharpening, it's always tempting to go a little further when editing for print, but you have to be really careful not to go too far, as the consequences can be severe. When you're new to this stuff, it's definitely worth having a practice and printing it out before working on too many, as too much sharpening in print can make the photograph look plastic and fake, and trust me, I'm talking from experience right there. I'm going to hit the undo button to see the original image, and then the redo button to see our sharpening filter applied, and I think we've nicely hit the balance between getting enough sharpening to produce our final effect and having too much that makes the image look fake and plastic. A good effort by all.